Hello and welcome to Dev Talk. I'm your host, Kevin Razmus, and in today's show, we have a special treat. We get to meet Lenaire. Now, I've worked personally with Lenaire, and he is a top-tier individual who's worked at some of the big-name companies in the industry. Recently, he's moved out into the market, but then transitioned into starting his own company as a freelance contractor, offering his services to some of the biggest names in the industry. Today, in this episode, he's going to dive in and give us some insights into the craziness that is tech interviews.
Oh, yeah.
He's got some great stories, so let's get into it. Lenaire, welcome to the show. I'm excited to see you, and I'm excited to dive into some of these juicy stories. If you could, just walk me through a little bit, because you've worked a big part of your career at big agencies, working on big names. From being on the ground as an engineer, developer, moving up into management, running teams, architecture. You have a very broad spectrum of skills that you've built over the last decade plus.
Oh, sure. So I've been in the industry for about 11 years now, and started out as a junior engineer and not really knowing too much, right, like most of us. And I've gotten the opportunity to get a lot of good experience working with a lot of different types of companies. I've worked in insurance. I've worked in e-commerce. I've worked on mobile. I've worked in technology, specifically cloud technology. And so I've been able to work with a lot of different individuals. And sort of a lot of my passion for the job has made me put in a little bit of extra work, which has allowed me also just to be able to move up a bit, like you mentioned. And so going from junior to mid engineer, right, to senior, and then to a team lead, to a tech lead. I even acted as a product owner for a while, being more in management roles, and then also more recently acting as a principal engineer. I've gotten to get a lot of experience from people that I've worked with, including yourself.
Yeah, and that's great, because not only have you worked on different platforms, different code bases, different languages, you've also worked in a lot of different roles. So this gives you a really good authority to speak on the state of these interviews, and especially with some of the ones that you've been through. And now I saw a few of your posts about your dealings with these interviews on LinkedIn. What was the biggest shock that you had? And then let's share some of the actual specifics of things that were requested during these interviews.
Oh, sure. So, the biggest shock is that, so in one of my previous roles, I worked there for maybe 6 years. And then I took the leap from that position to another role as a principal engineer at a startup. Very, very exciting when I got in. And so getting that role was not so difficult. But when it comes to looking for subsequent roles, I realized interviewing is kind of a skill of its own. So it's this whole other set of skills that you have to learn, which, for all intents and purposes, really don't predict anything with regard to how well you'll actually perform in the role. I don't know if, a lot of people maybe, that have been around, my time, when I went to school, there was this old test called the FCAT. And the funny thing about the FCAT was that you had to pass the FCAT, at least in high school, in order to graduate. It became so bad that many students that performed well were not allowed to graduate on time because they couldn't pass this test. And this test, really wasn't always the most relevant to the actual classes that you were taking. And so, eventually the FCAT was done away with, and now it's much more progressive testing. But I remember actually having entire classes dedicated to taking the FCAT. These weren't classes for business skills, whatever you might think is practical for going to college, classes just for the FCAT. So that's honestly how I felt stepping back into the job market. Wow, I'm pretty rusty. I'm not really that good at this.
Yeah, so you've got to pre-study for a test it's just studying for the test and not the actual skills you need. Because there are just some weird questions that exist only in an interview process. Now you've been on quite a few interviews before you switched over to your own business.
Yeah.
But what is the craziest one that you got hit with while you're on an interview?
So I recall I was interviewing for essentially like a front end architect role. And so, I'll say that getting interviews was actually very, very simple. I was able sort of to polish up my resume a bit, and I had some help with that. But when it came to the actual position, so here I am interviewing for. I want to say in this case, it was this company that had acquired multiple other companies, and they're looking sort of just to create a simple user interface, right? That's linking all of the common functionality between all these different systems and to get rid of all the legacy stuff. And so it's pretty straightforward. And they wanted someone to specialize in UI architecture, to specialize in, obviously application performance, and then obviously reusability is a big one because, they've got hundreds of engineers, some that have come from these other companies that they've acquired. And so it's like, we want to make a common stitching or, a common look and feel for all of these applications that we're merging. And so it really does take a good in-depth, knowledge of a lot of front end, best practices of libraries like React that they had chosen. So, you're focusing a lot on performance, you're focusing a lot on UX and design, you're focusing on accessibility and all these other things to try and make sure that, essentially every engineer is aware of what you have so that they're not rebuilding, things that already exist. Now, that is what I would have interpreted as the role. And so when I get into this interview, so the beginning of the interview goes really well. And so the hiring manager is asking me all of the right questions. He's asking me some good questions about React. We're diving into depth about, even versions of React. We're diving into depth about hooks, functional React, right? Versus classical React, which was much more about life cycles and things like that. And, we're comparing and contrasting, right? So he understands that I have a pretty good in-depth knowledge of it. And so one of the engineers that he brings along, so he sends me this data structures and algorithm question, like right in the chat. So it's like, hey, I want you to solve this. And so initially the question is, the ask is for me to print out the value, like some values like 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's 2 objects in the structure, and one of them is relatively flat, and it's got keys that I can match to deeply nested values in a second object. And looping over the second object, I have to print out the keys from like the first object that match the deeply nested value. And so he's like, answer this. And so essentially, I'm like, okay, so first, do you want me to do this imperatively or declaratively, right? Because there's a much more simple way, right? Just based on outputs and established methods that I can do this. Or do you want me to sort of show my work and show that I understand some basic concepts of essentially of different types of array sorts, swaps, things like that we do with regard to certain types of sorts, whether it's like a bubble sort or whatever. So he couldn't quite answer how they wanted me to show it. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to show my work. I'll do it imperatively. And so the question wasn't quite asked in the right way. The data structure was missing values for the appropriate output. And so I spend about maybe 30 minutes on it. And I answer it, but like I use like a nested for loop. So it's a function of, n squared or whatever you call it in big O notation. And so the hiring manager is like, hey, we'd like you to optimize this. Can you spend a few more minutes on it after this interview and then send it back to us? And I'm already a little bit annoyed because I've got like several more interviews to do that day, actually. And I'm like, okay, I'll spend a few more minutes on this. I'll try and optimize it. And so I go back and I optimize it. I detail out and I explain the question properly. I update the data structure to what it should be, and then I send it back a little bit in a sassy way to where I say, hey, here is the question asked in the proper way. Here is the proper data structure for the requested output. And if you would like to see real coding examples that are related to the job, I can send you the links to some GitHub repositories. And obviously I got ghosted after that.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of us have been on that interview where like you either get a laptop slid over to you. The worst that I've been in is where they opened up their whiteboard and had a bunch of code written out there and wanted me to do it with a marker and write the solution there. Now, a question that I have, which I think highlights one of the big issues here with interviewing, the solution to this wouldn't work with the sample data that they gave you because the sample data was incomplete. Do you think that was because they were testing you to see if you would notice that and solve it? Or was it because they have responsibilities to do on their job and quickly try to put something together so that they had something to test interviewees with?
If the question hadn't been sent over in the Zoom chat, and if I were actually provided some type of an online sandbox with the question already pre-designed, then I would assume the former. But I absolutely think it's what you said. And I think that's kind of what a lot of hiring managers are experiencing right now, is that they're trying to fill these open positions. But one, they're not being taught well how to properly search for talent. And then a lot of them, especially with regard to the engineers that are performing the interviews, they don't really know what questions to ask for the actual role. So they're doing their best. Like, they're doing Google searches for, like, hey, how does Facebook hire? How does Microsoft hire? Like, they're looking for potentially for, like, maybe some generic methods that one would assume to be proven, because these tech giants that are laying off thousands, by the way, once upon a time when they were very successful in producing products that were doing well, which we haven't seen for like years now, potentially. This is what they did. And so it seems like people are looking to the example of some of these tech giants who were famous for this way of interviewing, assuming like, hey, we're going to find a cream of the crop.
Yeah. And it's great to find inspiration, especially if you're stuck and you need help coming up with questions. But when you're interviewing somebody for a PHP or C# or React front end or whatever position it is, you shouldn't be asking complex physics questions in there, because that's not what they're going to be solving. Right? And we've all seen it, like the 10 crazy questions from Google interviews and things like that. But again, some of those positions in Google and some of the things that they were doing with experiments became very high level, and they wanted people with critical thinking across a wide array of things, where 99% of tech jobs do not require that. They require you to understand how to write code in the language that you're doing and how to structure it so other people can use it after you, and it's optimized to where you don't blow up the servers with it. Mm-hmm. But it gets really crazy. And I've been in that position where the CTO of a company came up to me and they're like, hey, prepare some questions. We've got 3 people coming in for interviews tomorrow. I want you to lead that and just screen them, make sure that they'll fit in, and make sure that they can actually perform the work. And I did that too. I was like, top 10 questions for JavaScript interviews.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And because we were running it was a front end position building in JavaScript. This was before React and Angular existed. So we had used a library, built our own framework. And what I did with that is I grabbed some of those just basic understanding of JavaScript questions, and then I peppered in things from our actual code base of open tickets of things that either I would be working on, or if they started within the next week, they would be working on. And so I questioned them on that type of stuff. So I understand the pressure, and I understand that it's easy to get into these things, but it's gone so far out of hand that it's crazy. So do you have any other stories? That was one interview. I know that you went on more than one that had some craziness like that.
And I'll tell you, that probably was one of the funnier encounters, just because I sort of let my pettiness get the better of me. But honestly, I'd been on so many that actually went relatively well. It was really, now every single interview that I went on did not have a crazy data structures and algorithm question, but I was still baffled at how many did. And I recall rejecting several interviews because I was getting fed up with it. One of them was for just a senior front-end engineer role. Specifically, I want to say this one was related to design systems. And like the first 2 stages of the interview process, there's this long detailed list of the interview process. And it's like data structures and algorithms, 30 minutes. And it, and it's giving you an idea of like what kind of questions, you're expected to answer. And it's like a few minutes on react, and I'm not exaggerating. It's like a few minutes on front end technologies, and then the second step is like more data structures and algorithms. And I'm like, I don't have the time for this anymore, man. I just don't. So I would say that just about every interview either required data structures and algorithms, or some type of a take home test, or in the better cases, live coding with somewhat of a real world example for you to solve. Yeah.
See, okay, so here's some of the crazy ones that I've seen, like the brain twister ones that have nothing to do with code. Like the one that I was telling you about. If you're driving 45 miles an hour in a car, there's a helium balloon behind you, and you slam on your brakes, which direction does the balloon go? Like, why would I need to know that? So I was like, backwards. And they're like, oh, that was right. Like,
I definitely got that one wrong.
How did you know that? Yeah. And again, like, I guess I was like, I had a 50-50 shot here. I went backwards. And once I started thinking about it, I was like, well, when you stop, you go forward because you have mass. There's air in the car with you, which is mass. The helium balloon is floating within that. So it would go backwards because there's more pressure at the front. Seemed logical. That was for a WordPress position back in my PHP days.
Nice.
I mentioned the whiteboard. That one is wildly crazy because who handwrites code? Like, no. Even like getting a laptop slid around to you and they want you to live code in like Notepad with no IntelliSense. Like, we all use IDEs to help us get there. And like, I don't discount a developer if they don't remember the exact structure and they rely on certain things to be auto-filled for them.
We use a lot of Stack Overflow, man, too. And there's always the question, why are you doing it this way? Just give me the right answer. But I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of these tests, they just don't take into account the different skill sets that people have. The truth is, like, the hot shot in a room is not always going to be the best person to work with. And there's this whole other set of soft skills that really get missed completely or are just an afterthought in the interview process. And so part of it, right, as we've talked about, is the complete and utter lack of preparation. But the other part is just a fundamental misunderstanding by hiring engineers, by the engineers that are, or hiring managers, and then the engineers that are interviewing. It's like, hey, first of all, who do we need culturally on this team? There's a whole side of positive psychology that states roughly maybe there's like 48 skills that humans can potentially have. And so when you talk about building a team, think about how a basketball team works together, right? Everyone can't be a power forward. In basketball, the optimal height for success is 6'6". And that's how tall Michael Jordan was. And, as you get much taller than that, it's not really a better predictor for success. But it is a whole bunch of other skills, like leadership or teamwork, right? Being able to build up a team is really what makes the difference. And it's even the same for IQ. Like, as far as being the most successful person in the world, the optimum IQ or the average IQ is 120. So your lawyers, your doctors, like, your entrepreneurs that we see every day that are like, millionaires, billionaires. What becomes much more valuable is a completely different skill set or a completely different mindset, which, it's essentially relates a lot more to social skills. It turns out that
the ability and openness to learn.
Absolutely. And just having a different mindset with regard to how you solve problems. And so it seems like this is completely missed for how can we actually build a functioning team where people have different strengths that complement each other.
Yep. There's a couple more crazy things that I want to get out before we start moving into solutions here. You mentioned IQ. Okay. So there's two things that I've been in on the interviewee side, where one of them were these extreme time constraints where you get sent a link to an interview coding platform where it pops up the thing they want you to solve and you have a text area, and then it has a timer ticking. Some of them count down where you have 18 minutes to solve this data problem And some of them were so obscure and complex. Like with those, at least you can hop on Google, hop on Stack Overflow, but they are carefully written to not be ones that you can easily find.
Yeah.
And I made it through and I passed it. But the anxiety that I had, if that is the type of environment of this company, oh my gosh, no, I want nothing to do with it.
That's the hazing process. That's what that is.
It's crazy. And then there are other companies that agree with you on the IQ thing. And I've actually had IQ, aptitude, and personality tests given me as part of the interview process.
That is pretty special. That is pretty, and not even in a bad way, actually. There's entire consultant companies that specialize in building quality teams, and that's part of the process. It's actual person.
Sure.
Well, look, listen, personality tests that help identify what people are strong at. And then that way, the entire team is aware of each person's strengths, what they're good at. And now you're enabled to better understand your teammates and help them hyper focus on what they're good at. It turns out trying to be a jack of all trades does not provide better output. The people that are hyper focused and have a specific skill set and that are experts, those are the ones that have the best output. But it seems like every single, job posting is looking for an entire IT team.
Yeah, the full stack engineer. The one person to rule it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't agree with that, especially at the interview process. There are different ways of going about it without being that intrusive. Also, that interview took 3 hours.
That's a regular interview nowadays, man.
It was intense. Well, that was before we even got into coding tests. This was interview 1 of 3 that I went through with this company.
It's pretty brutal.
It was.
Yeah.
So we both have some wild experiences, and I think a lot of people out there relate. I've heard some crazy stories that are very much in line with this.
Yeah.
And yeah, we haven't even touched on the whole intrusive practices as far as like remote working goes, but that's a whole different episode.
Yeah.
So now, okay, we've identified the problem. With these interviewing, a lot of times the people that get pulled into it, only half of them are prepared and ready. Others have other responsibilities and quickly put questions together to put in there. Others are just inexperienced or have that personality trait of wanting to feel superior, so they intentionally make it difficult for people and make them squirm because they enjoy that. And a lot of it is just simply lack of knowledge on how to interview. So that's the problem. What are the solutions?
Well, it's the solutions from the end of the interviewee or the interviewer.
Let's start with how companies could handle interviews better.
Man,
you have a good grasp on it because you've interviewed people. You've also been on the other side looking for a job. So how could a company better solve for these interviews?
I don't think in a lot of the process that there's enough emphasis placed on cultural fits. And so kind of back to a little bit of my previous rant about personality types. It's really important to build a team that works well together, and that can be very difficult. In entire teams of, you can't build an entire team of leaders. So, you're going to be able to have to really put together a team that is almost like puzzle pieces or kind of like, essentially like a chessboard. So you're going to have different members that have different skill sets. You may have some team members that are better with communication. May have some team members that are better with taking initiative. You may have some that are much more creative and are better able to find, different types of solutions to very, very difficult problems. But if you don't find those types of personalities for your team, then how is your team really going to be successful when it comes to delivering, a wide array of different features? And so I think that there probably should be more of an importance placed on cultural fit and people's mindsets. And of course, that's really hard to necessarily identify in, a short interview process, but maybe easing up on the gas a little bit from just strict technical skills and maybe being a little bit more balanced in a person's potential according to how they fit culturally. And you also have to understand, if you're hiring for an existing team, what is your team actually missing, right? So who's left this team, or who did you remove from the team? Why did you remove them? And what is it that the team actually needs? Like, why aren't they producing what you want them to produce? Or why are you hiring for this role? So let's identify culturally what it is that you actually need for the role, and make it a little bit more of an even split. The technical skills can be learned very, very quickly. Like, I've done a lot of interviews, and I never fully focused on the technical skills. A lot of times I really focused on the person's personality and their desire for the task at hand. And so in the long term, I feel like I've been able to help put together a lot of teams that are still functioning teams. A lot of people that are still in those positions that I hired them for, but it takes a lot of work, and potentially a lot of emotional intelligence to be able to I sort of identify what a team needs and how different personality types work together.
Yeah, it really comes down to a pretty basic principle for the company to follow. Interview for the position that you're hiring for, right? Mm-hmm. Great principle. But what does that actually mean? Ask questions that will allow them to show their knowledge that will apply to the things they'll actually be doing. If they're going to be working with sorting complex data structures with raw JavaScript or C or whatever it is, ask them questions about that. Pull from the actual projects that they'll be working on. The other thing that I really love to see is when people actually put that in their job post of the type of things you'll be working on, and ask you to supply in your portfolio or in your history of work something that is similar, so that you can pull from your history and show what you've already done that can apply to it. If you don't have that, here's a sample scope of a project that you should be able to put together within a few hours to showcase your skill. Now, with the availability of AI and things like that, a lot of people are going to be just dropping that in and putting that through. So it's going to be more difficult to figure out if they actually wrote it or not. But at the same time, if they supply something that fits exactly what you need, isn't that what you want?
Mm-hmm. But so, the assumption is always that the hot shot will just have much higher output. And, I think that if there were more data to show that there is absolutely no, GitLab actually did a pretty interesting study on this not so long ago when they decided to change up their interview process. So they did a pretty comprehensive study on take-home projects, on live coding interviews, and they were able to come up with a pretty quality process where they're essentially putting you through a little bit of a daily workflow to see if you actually understand working on a team. And so, they'll actually put you through a workflow where they're like, hey, we want you to create a commit. We want you to rebase this commit or merge this commit. We want you to add comments. Like, they're actually putting you through a real workflow, and it's one that won't take so long for you to actually complete. And so, that's a little bit of the problem that you run into, even when it comes to screening, is that every person doesn't necessarily even have the time to do what it is that you're asking for. And so, some people find themselves in a difficult position when it comes to all of these methods for how we might try and see if they have a basic level of competency,
Yeah. Yeah. So overall, I think those are great solutions. There's a lot to be said about just simply taking a step back when you are going to interview somebody and try to remember what you felt like when you were in that position. And don't use that to make it worse for them. Use that to be able to pull out the intelligence that they have. Most people that are coming in for an interview have worked at other places. They have solved problems for other companies. Allow them to pull on that history, because that's what you're hiring, is all the expertise, all the learned things that they've built up to that point that now they're sitting in front of you. How is that going to help the company? Use that rather than these robotic questions that don't actually pull out anything other than the anger and frustration of hoping that you've answered enough of that stuff right to where they'll let you pass through, and then you can actually start learning the context of the company and apply your skills to it. It's crazy world. So that's for the business side of it. Let's talk about the employee, the interviewee side.
Yeah. What do you do?
What are some tactics you can use to overcome these live coding questions, especially live ones that are done where they just turn something around, want you to do it in front of them? What are some of the solutions there for the employee?
So it depends on whether or not the employee wants to participate in a very broken system or not. And so I would just say, if you choose to participate, you basically have to become a student of the interviewing process. So it's wild. I've seen books for how to interview at Microsoft. There's entire courses that are dedicated to sort of giving you some of the types of questions that you'll encounter. So really, you have to become a student of the interview process if you want to participate in this, and hopefully some of those skills will translate to the job. So you have to become. Pull out that, yeah. So you have to go back to, you have to take some courses on data structures and algorithms, and then there's a whole other conversational side and a whole other side of interview charm that you need, right? Just to be likable, and a whole lot of patience that you're going to need to deal with the personalities that ask you these questions. So if you're going to participate, you have to become a student of the interview process, which I heavily advise against.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something to be said about that. Learn as much as you can about the company you're about to interview with, whether big or small. It doesn't take long to do a deep dive on their website, look at the LinkedIn profiles, try and find the people you're going to be talking to, look at some of their work history, and use that to your advantage, just because you'll now know something about them and you can relate to them. And it'll also show that you understand the company and the things that they've done. Look up some of the projects. If it's an agency you're working for or interviewing with, look at their past clients. Maybe you have something in common there. That's going to be huge. And like you mentioned too, study up on the type of questions that they might ask. Simply practice writing for loops in whatever the base language is without a framework, without IntelliSense, and then write it to reverse an array, and then write it to filter an array, and then some of those basic things, which we don't do all the time. And usually when we have to, you pop up Stack Overflow, you're like, oh yeah, I forgot how to arrange this. It's this variable first, it's this, and then you put it in, and then you refresh with it. We've all done it. We can't retain 100% of all of the different little intricacies of the edge cases. But interviews want to capitalize on that and make sure that you're able to answer that in front of them, sometimes without any sort of coding assist.
Now let's talk about just quickly what they should do. So do not become a student of the process. Okay. All right. So here's what I did. And I definitely know that this is something that you would recommend. And so because I had so much free time, otherwise, while I wasn't interviewing, I spent a lot of time working on content. So I started writing articles on different technical topics. I spent a little more time on LinkedIn, getting myself out there. But I also worked a lot on personal projects. And so whether it was just some type of a project that was strictly for showcasing my skills, in an interview, or just, hey, here's a link. I also had my GitHub link in my resume, so people could just go to my public repos and see what I've done. And so something I think is very powerful that will set you apart. And perhaps if you have enough projects out there, or enough projects that you've participated in, right? If you have enough merges out there with various open source libraries, that might actually be able to help you skip some of the interview process altogether. Like if a company sees that you have this portfolio out there with all this quality work, and they're actually seeing the sort of the quality of code that you have, I think that's a much better way to push back on the market for engineers is, hey, just keep on polishing up your skills practically that you have. And then when it comes time for them to ask you these interviews or ask you these questions in the interview, you're like, hey, there's probably a better way we could spend our time. Let me show you the work that I've actually done. And so that's what that's the, essentially what I started focusing on when I switched over into consulting. And man, it was it was a much better, and I had a lot less frustration.
Yeah.
But
I
it
love
takes a
that.
mindset and a patience. It takes a mindset and a patience with the process.
Yeah, yeah. So you did a few things there. Getting on social media, putting as much out there as you can is huge because that gives you a bigger footprint. When they look up your name, they're going to see these articles that are authored for you. You know, if you're on medium.com and you've got all of those articles out there, you're showing code examples. They're going to see you that you're actually putting things out and that you are representing yourself as an expert on certain things. And that is great for people that are able to do that. Not everybody is comfortable authoring things and putting things out for public scrutiny and all of that. So if you can't do that, you can still capitalize on putting together the same type of information as a presentation in your interview. So bring a laptop along. If you're doing it virtually, you can share your screen and talk about things. So research the company. If you did a project, like let's say, pulling from my experience, I was on a team that built the framework and mobile platform for Cisco Foods' entire mobile ordering platform for the US. And that is a huge thing. Now, I couldn't publicize that. I couldn't put that in my portfolio. That was owned by the agency I worked with. But when I can interview, I can make a presentation on that. And if the interview I'm going on, they have clients where they're building platforms and frameworks and entire applications like this, I can do a presentation and show, here's a few of the big issues that we ran into early on. This is how we solved them. This is the approach that I took to come up with that solution. And make it more about all of your past skills and achievements and how those are going to apply to this new company that you're interviewing for and why you can help them. Call out specifics if you know them. Then, if the guy is sitting there or the person sitting there and they're like, well, okay, all of that is wonderful. Absolutely love that. But we have these coding questions we need to have you fill out because we prepared them. If you've done well with your presentation and showed different things that relate directly to it, you showed code snippets, you showed critical thinking, how you've learned new things and applied yourself to it, you can remind them politely, that's great that you prepared these questions. I just brought in a whole bunch of relevant information. I'm going to share all this with you guys so you can review it. I put together some code snippets of things, not to violate any NDAs, so you can actually see my coding abilities. I'm not comfortable doing live coding sessions in an interview session. If you have any questions about how I can solve problems for your company, if you want to show me a few things and we can kind of talk about it and how it relates to my past experience, I'd love to get into that. Okay, that does two things. One, you politely say, no, I'm not going to write in Notepad here and fill out these code things because I've already shown you that I do that. Show me some respect. Two, you've showed leadership skills. These are the types of scenarios you're going to get into when you're working with a team and clients where you need somebody that is able to have some boldness and critical thinking and how to solve these things without pissing people off. It's hard to be polite when it's in a high-pressure critical situation. And if you show that in the interview process, you can even call that out and say, guys, I'd like to just highlight the way that I've handled this with you is the same way that I would handle pushy clients and critical scenarios with that where I'm representing your company. This is how I would do it with them as well. And hopefully that makes you feel comfortable and have confidence. That completely changes the dynamic. You've politely refused, and you've used it to showcase a strength that you can't argue with. Granted, it's easier to say that when we're, in a room without like our livelihood on the line.
Exactly.
But that's where practice comes in. Pull out the FCAT, like you said, but don't apply it to learning weird data structures and algorithms that you're not going to use on the job. Use it to apply how you're going to handle these situations and different talking points. When they say something to you, come up with a few ideas. Practice the scenario with some other people so you can actually say it out loud and hear somebody else's reaction. So that's solution number 2. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I like the fact that you mentioned, when your livelihood is not on the line. And that's something that a lot of people feel like they're experiencing, or maybe it's something that they are experiencing. And so what would you suggest as an alternative? Or would it make a difference, groveling versus showing the leadership, if your livelihood is on the line? What do you think?
Oh, no. Like, if somebody's begging, like, you want somebody that can stand up for themselves when you're hired. You want somebody with confidence. People are drawn to confidence. And even if it is a pre-canned thing that you wrote down and you're like partially reading or something like that, it still comes across. You can still do it, because that is what confidence is.
Yeah.
It's being bold. You're still scared. Being bold and having confidence doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward with it, even though you have fear, and just keeping that in the right place.
Yeah. And, I think that's such a good point. And fortunately, throughout my job search, I had a lot of the support of my wife, and she constantly would tell me, because I was very disappointed when after, 6 or 7 rounds of interviews, right? Like roughly 7 hours, and you're essentially meeting the entire team, and you do relatively well, but you don't get the position because someone wrote a better sorting algorithm. And so, there's times when I felt like I felt almost like a disappointment. It's like, you're just like, wow, like I really thought I was kind of decent at my job. Maybe I'm not. But it always comes down to whether or not, it really is a good fit for you. And so she would always stress, you know what, that job just wasn't a good fit for you. And it wasn't just her being a yes man, right? Like, she would be very honest with me. Like, if I were bombing some of these interviews, right, she would be able to hear it. She'd like, she'd let me know, like, hey, you're probably not the best interview. And so that also is so important. And so if it does come to a role to where you sort of remaining honest with regard to your principles, your integrity, if the company does not accept that from you, you would have probably been miserable working for that company in the first place.
Yeah, I love something that you called out there too. This is huge. And I never really thought about it this way, but a post-game review. Like, after the interview, just walk through it. While you're in the interview, take notes. And especially if you can have somebody else listening to it and then critique you afterwards, like, that will go a long way for your confidence, because either, yeah, you got weird on this question. Like, I don't know what you were thinking with that.
You took that
Definitely
personal.
don't say that again. Or like the fact that they could look at it and be like, yeah, that was a really weird question that they were pushing there. Like, thankfully, like, yeah, don't go back to them. That was a bad interview. That like that would suck. And that kind of helps you steer in the right direction too, of if you're doing something wrong, like, why on earth am I getting rejected at all of these? The bad news on that is there is a huge supply of developers and designers right now that are all going for these jobs. When some of these higher end companies are putting out these job postings, they're getting anywhere between 300, 3,000 or more applicants that they have to sort through. And then they have a huge job of picking the people. So that's where a lot of these bad practices come through with some of these pre-screenings too, just because there's so many applicants.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about two solutions. The way companies can fix it, the way employees can deal with it and turn it around and show their strengths. But a lot of people don't either realize this, or they're too worried or afraid to get into it.
Oh yeah.
But skip the interview process entirely and start freelancing. Get your LLC, get some business insurance, and put up a single page website highlighting some of your skills. Obviously, if you've been an employee your entire career, you're not going to have a portfolio. Make something, or write a really decent article, put some good photos in there, and then reach out to your local network. Everybody you know. The more that you put out there, the higher the probability is that you're going to get a bite on something. 3 degrees of separation. You tell a friend, they tell their brother tells a friend, and they're your client. All it takes is one client to expand your mind to the possibilities that are out there. And Lenaire, this is what you did. So what was it, the transformation in your mind that helped you get over that hurdle to I have to interview and get a job. To the point where then you were like, I have to form my LLC and get my first client. What was that hurdle? How did you get over it?
I'll tell you, man. I think the hurdle was just me being tired of participating in a really, really poor process. And so, after I wish I kept count of how many interviews I went on, and how far I got, on average. But after sort of meeting my limit of frustration in a process that I just thought was very, very demeaning and really did not reflect in many situations my actual experience or skill level, I just decided, you know what? I'm going to have a hand at this. And so, you and I had talked about this, on several occasions before, where I had a curiosity about what it takes to start your own business, what it takes to run it. And I had the same, sort of fears as any other person does. How can I guarantee having a steady income? I don't know the first thing about running a business, right? So it's always scary when you're jumping into something completely, new for the first time. But ultimately, I just made that decision of, you know what? I don't want to have these kinds of people as my boss or as my manager. I want to offer my skills as a service, and I want to be on the same level and be respected at the same level as my clients.
Yeah, let's break that down. And I love the fact that you said same level. When you are going in for an interview to be an employee, the level is more like this, and the company is looking down at you as somebody who needs something from them, almost to the point of being annoyed by the fact that you're there, and you've got to look up and please, let me have this job. Not all of them are like that. I'm talking about the worst case scenarios here. Some of them are very great and very respectful. A lot of them are. But then I've been on both sides of this, to where I've talked to people and it was like this begging scenario. And then when a company needs to get somebody quickly and they need to hire something out, so they go for a freelancer or an agency that offers team augmentation, it's a completely different scenario where when you sit down and meet with them, they're like, hey, here's how we need you to help us. We have this problem, this problem, this problem. How would you solve that? And it's still an interview process, because you don't just get a free hire and a free contract. Like, you still have to talk to them and make sure it's a good fit. But it's on a level playing field, and there's a lot more respect. And sometimes it's to the point where they're looking up at you saying, please help us with this. Do you have time? Can you help us, please? And then it's up to you to be like, well, tell me about your problem. Let me hear about it. Okay. This is how I would solve it. I would take this type of approach. And it's very much how the employee interview should be, because there is a power dynamic. The leverage is completely different there. And it's great for the people that are able to get over that hurdle like you did, because it is scary running your own business versus being an employee. You have to be the sales. You have to be the cold calls. You have to be the discovery calls. You have to be the producer. You have to be the producer. You have to be friendly with so many people and intelligent with it. It takes a lot to land these contracts, but it expands your brain to where you start to see this unlimited potential, because you're not obligated to work a 40-hour work week between the hours of 8 and 6. When you're a contractor, you're obligated to put together your scope of work and your deliverables. And depending on the nature of that, it's either when will there be certain checkpoints and final deliverable. If it's an ongoing contract, what is the output to be expected on like a weekly or monthly basis? And then you get to set your own schedule. Personally, I work on client work Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Thursday is sales and outreach. Friday is working on internal things on my own company, to continue building things and learning new skills. So for you took all of that. You put together the website. You put together the LLC, got the business liability insurance, and then you started reaching out to your network. How did that go? What was the fear and the feeling once you actually got a call back?
The fear for the callbacks were essentially, well, I've never been in this position to where now I'm on this level with you and I'm attempting to negotiate. Like, how do I sell myself? So that was initially the fear, is like, how do I conduct these conversations? What am I supposed to say to sell myself? And so it's, I'll tell you. So what I started out doing is exactly what you said, was reaching out to my local network. So I reached out to my local network. I just had conversations with people, sort of let them know that I was starting up my own thing. And fortunately, because I don't have such an aggressive sales mindset, I was okay with being patient with the process, and just, at least, if nothing else, I'm building up good relationships. I'm letting people know of my skill set and what I can do. And in the future, there's a good chance that they may like the impression that I left, and they may want to come back to me in the future when it may be time for me to perform some work for them. But I'm not just going to take anything. I may not be the right person for the job. And so maybe that's not the smartest business decision. I don't know. But I believe that the best business decision is to have good relationships and to build trust with people. And I think that'll keep you in business for a longer period of time. And so I focused on building relationships. I focused on sort of putting myself out there to my local network. And then I also started going out to different events. And so I went out to events. I just had conversations with people. I had some awesome conversations with people, met up with them again. And now I'm in a position to where already they're sort of potentially coming back to me now, even to start doing some work for them. And so a lot of it is mindset, but also, fortunately, I made use of a lot of the skills of people that I know. So obviously, me and you chatted a lot, and so I got a lot of mentoring and information from you. So I also reached out to my local network of people who are already doing this to learn as much as I could from them, and that was like so phenomenal in getting me off the ground.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you said that you were patient with it, because it's a slow process. Just like growing or like working out and building muscle, it doesn't happen overnight. You have to give yourself time to start being comfortable with how things are changing with the different types of conversations. And there's a base principle here for everybody to apply. And that is, give 100% in everything that you do. Okay. And the reason for this is you bring quality to everything that you do. It doesn't matter. Like, if you're going to be on a call with a potential client, set up your backdrop, set up some light, take 15 minutes before the call and just make it look nicer. If you've got a bunch of messy cables or something behind you, just unplug them and move them out of the way. Just bring quality. Okay. And when you do that, and the client's like, well, we don't have a lot of work. We've got this tiny little thing. And you look at it and you're like, this is $180. Like, this is like an hour's worth of work. Mm-hmm. It might be tempting to be like, guys, you're not worth my time. But if they're in a bind and they actually took the time to ask you if you can help with this little thing, dude, knock it out of the park for them. Spend an hour on it. Spend 2 hours on it. Like, really do great with it. And charge them the $180. Okay? I'm speaking from experience on this. I've done this for a project. It turned into a design thing, and they're like, yeah, we have this thing. It needs to be sent to the printer in 2 days. And I was like, this is like a simple task. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, all right, I'll do it. Knocked it out of the park. Not only did I like dive into what they wanted, I talked about their colors that they use for the company, matched it up to the actual Pantone colors that the printer was going to be using, gave them a print sheet, gave them all of the stuff that you do on like a large project for this tiny little thing. And it was patience that was required with this. That $180, the next project I worked for them on, was $36,000. In the second year, the revenue from that client was well over $100K for a single client. And it was all because I brought 100% on something that seemed to be not worth my time. And that client turned into a 12-year client.
So you didn't oversell and underdeliver.
No. No, and that's the thing though. And even with you, the first client that you got, it started out with not the most favorable terms, but you didn't reject them. you were patient with it. You absorbed it. You came back with a counter. You negotiated with them, which how often as an employee do you negotiate with an employer? Like, not too often. And this worked out really well for you. And you have a really good client out of it. And the great thing is you're a contractor. Now you can land a second client because you're not an employee. You're not obligated to 40 hours. You need to run this like a business. You need to look at it of how am I going to start building this to where I can hire somebody else, right? So for you, I know the mindset right now is focusing on this client and doing the best you can, learning it very well, but then start using the output from that to build up your social media, write articles about the solutions that you're providing, outline the problems, land a second client, hire your first employee, or if it's too much to hire an employee, hire another contractor or freelancer that will work under you. And then you get to start expanding your mind again of bidding on these jobs and pricing them and getting into one of my favorite topics, which is getting away from hourly billing, understanding the value proposition, price bracketing, and estimating these things to have you keep stepping out and moving closer to that CEO role where you're not directly working in the projects, if that's where you want to be. I personally love to keep my brain active and keep my hands in projects and writing code and filming videos and doing things. So even though I'm stepping back and hiring more people to help around me, I still get to be very much involved. To get to that point.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just, it's interesting the concept of the pricing model that you bring up, which I like a lot. And I'm so glad that we had these conversations before I went into hourly work. Thank goodness that I didn't. And so, one interesting thing is that, I feel like when you do price in a way that's scalable, when you're not pricing hourly, I feel like that's a way to help you build more confidence, especially if it is a competitive price, because, it's kind of innately the assumption that more often than not, right, assuming you have some record, right, of success, things that are priced more naturally must have more value. And so when you get away from sort of this hourly mindset and you have this flat rate that is that is very high, but you're also guaranteeing, hey, listen, this is what I've proven to offer, then you can also get away with much more scalable pricing and pricing in such a way that you can actually bring on other people, right? And ultimately have that 4-hour work week. And so that's something like that's one of the snippets where if I were just to have jumped into this and not have asked anyone or not have gotten any mentoring or any help, this is probably a lesson it might have taken me a couple years to learn alone, is on the idea of a scalable pricing model that's not hourly. Yeah.
And just for anybody listening here, when you take freelance work, it'll be very tempting to bill hourly, like you were saying, Lenaire. But as you learn too, when you start thinking about it, like if you bill hourly, you're going to start doing clock in, clock out. And then if you need to take time off, or you need like Fridays or Thursdays, you're working on sales and outreach under your company, your output is still what you promised, but your time is now much less. And you start getting into that moral dilemma of billing properly. But if you agree on the output that you're going to have and you give them a weekly rate, now you're freed up to deliver that and work as fast as you can on it. And guess what? When you're not working hourly and you get things done faster, you get rewarded. You get a bonus. Versus if you're working hourly, instead of 8 hours, you get it done in 4, you just discounted yourself by 50%. You just penalized yourself by doing better. And if you ask any client that is buying something from you and you're like, hey, I can get this code written and this application delivered to you in 1 month, or we can get it to you in 1 week, which is more valuable? Obviously, the 1 week. They're going to pay more for it, but you're going to spend less time on it. How is that more valuable? I used less of my life to do this. That's how value works. Most of the time, speed is more valuable. Hourly billing, just you penalize yourself for being good. And you're too good. You work as fast as 2 average people. You should be billing for that.
And also, obviously, when you step into this world and whether it's proposals that you're writing, whatever the case, there's some expected output that they want. So you say, hey, I agree to provide this feature or this set of features. And so when they agree, when they sign the dotted line for that price and you say, I'm going to deliver it by this date, why would they care how long it took you if you delivered it by that date? They might be concerned if you're trying to nickel and dime them, right? So it just seems like it's just such a better process anyway for building confidence. Hey, this is my rate. This is how it's done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Lenaire, congratulations on your success. It's awesome to see your story and the whole transition and the success that you've had with everything. I think this is a good place to close. So just to summarize, what we've just gone through here is the entire job interview process from the business side, the problems, the solutions, things that you can solve on your own in these problematic interviews and come out with strengths. And then an alternate path that Lenaire took that, in my opinion, for a lot of people is the right path right now. Any last words, Lenaire? Anything that you want to add? Any advice for people that are contemplating dropping the interview process or even maybe quitting their job they have now to get into freelancing?
Oh, absolutely. So first, I would say it's when you offer advice, right, we have to acknowledge that it's not going to be applicable to everyone. And so really a lot of what we've spoken about are for certain mindsets, and everyone's not going to have the same mindset. And then you need to somewhat have the proper circumstances. And so in my case, I wasn't as much in a rush to find a job because I had a decent amount of savings. And I have a little bit of a sugar mama of a wife that was patient with me. And so I was able to take a little bit more time and focus on developing my skills, and then also going through this process of learning how to build up a business properly from a lot of the different resources and mentors that I had. And so first, if you are of the mindset, and then if you do have the circumstances, I would say that you definitely want to be very, very patient, and you want to build up a good reputation. And it's not to say that having an aggressive sales mindset is wrong. And that actually does work for some people. But I think it may be difficult when you're first starting out. I think it's good to build a good reputation and have a good local network. And then eventually these people will start to reach out to you just by word of mouth. So, hey, you could spend all sorts of money on Google and Instagram and different ad services. But for me, just having that patient mindset and trying to build relationships with people and build up their trust, in my opinion, is very, very valuable.
Well said. Well said. Well, that brings us to the end of this very engaging conversation focused on the exciting world of tech.
Dev Talk. It's like getting invited out by the top performers after work to chat. This episode is brought to you by Dev Nova, the project management platform that coaches you along the way.